Deputy Jax, would you just take a step back, please? Thank you. All right, records reflect that Mr. Simpson has both gloves. Yes.
State of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, case number BA097211. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, as charged in count 1 of the information.
The warm California sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Brentwood on that fateful Sunday evening of June 12, 1994. In this wealthy enclave of Los Angeles, where palm trees swayed gently in the Pacific breeze and million-dollar homes sat nestled behind wrought iron gates, few could have imagined the horror that was about to unfold. This was a neighborhood where celebrities lived quietly, where children played safely in front yards, and where the most shocking news was usually about property values or restaurant openings. But on this night, 2 lives would be brutally cut short in a crime so savage and shocking that it would captivate not just America, but the entire world for decades to come. Nicole Brown Simpson had spent the evening as she often did, surrounded by the familiar comforts of family life. The 35-year-old mother of 2 had attended her daughter Sydney's dance recital earlier that day at Paul Revere Middle School in Brentwood, watching from the audience as her 8-year-old performed with the innocent joy that only children possess. Nicole had been radiant in her pride, her blonde hair catching the auditorium lights as she applauded enthusiastically. Her younger child, 6-year-old Justin, sat beside her, fidgeting in his small suit and tie, occasionally waving at his sister on stage. The recital was one of those perfect suburban moments that seemed to represent everything Nicole had been working toward since her divorce, a normal, peaceful life centered around her children's happiness and achievements. After the recital, the family had gathered at Mezzaluna, an upscale Italian restaurant on San Vicente Boulevard in Brentwood where Nicole was a regular customer. The restaurant was known for its authentic cuisine and celebrity clientele, a place where the wealthy residents of the area could enjoy excellent food without the intrusion of paparazzi or gawking tourists. The atmosphere that evening was warm and celebratory, filled with the chatter of proud parents and the excitement of children who had just performed on stage. Nicole's parents, Lou and Judy the Brown, had joined them for dinner, along with her sisters and other family members. It was exactly the kind of multi-generational family gathering that Nicole cherished, a stark contrast to the tension and conflict that had defined so much of her adult life. But even in these moments of joy, there were undercurrents of tension that those close to Nicole couldn't ignore. Her ex-husband, Orenthal James Simpson, known to the world simply as OJ, had also attended the recital, sitting separately from Nicole and her family. The arrangement was typical of their post-divorce interactions, civil on the surface but charged with an emotional complexity that made everyone around them uncomfortable. OJ would later claim that he had tried to approach Nicole after the recital to compliment Sydney's performance, but that Nicole had been cold and dismissive, barely acknowledging his presence before turning away to talk with other parents. Once considered one of the greatest football players of all time, O.J. Simpson had achieved legendary status during his years with the Buffalo Bills, where his graceful running style and record-breaking performances had earned him the nickname The Juice. Born in San Francisco's Potrero Hill housing projects, O.J. had overcome a childhood marked by poverty and his father's absence to become a national icon. His rise to fame began at the University of Southern California, where he won the Heisman Trophy in 1968 and led the Trojans to 2 national championships. His college success translated seamlessly to the professional level, where he became the first player to rush for over 2,000 yards in a single season, a feat he accomplished in 1973 when the NFL season was only 14 games long. After retiring from football, O.J. had successfully transitioned into acting and broadcasting, becoming a beloved figure in American popular culture. His broad smile and charismatic personality had made him a household name, appearing in movies like The Naked Gun series and in countless commercials, most famously racing through airports for Hertz rental cars. These advertisements had made him one of the first African-American athletes to achieve true crossover appeal in corporate America, breaking down racial barriers while building a fortune estimated at over $10 million by the early 1990s. Yet beneath this public image of success and charm lay a more troubled reality. O.J.'s relationship with Nicole had been marked by cycles of passion and violence, love and fear, from almost the very beginning. They had first met in 1977 at the Daisy, an exclusive nightclub in Beverly Hills where Nicole worked as a waitress. She was just 18 years old, a recent high school graduate with dreams of modeling or acting, working at the club to make ends meet while she figured out her future. O.J. was already married to his first wife, Marguerite, but he was immediately captivated by the young blonde woman with the dazzling smile and infectious laugh. Nicole, barely out of high school and still naive about the complexities of adult relationships, was swept off her feet by the attention of this famous, wealthy man who seemed to represent everything glamorous about California life. O.J. was at the height of his fame and fortune, a man who could walk into any restaurant and be given the best table, who was recognized and adored wherever he went. For a young woman from what she considered a middle-class background in Garden Grove, the attention from someone of O.J.'s stature was intoxicating. Their courtship was intense and whirlwind, characterized by grand romantic gestures and expensive gifts. O.J. showered Nicole with jewelry, designer clothes, and exotic vacations, taking her to exclusive restaurants and introducing her to a world of luxury she had never imagined. He flew her to his games around the country, made her feel like she was part of something important and exciting. When his first marriage ended in divorce in 1979, Nicole became his constant companion, living in his shadow but basking in the reflected glow of his fame and success. The early years of their relationship seemed like a fairy tale from the outside. O.J. was attentive and generous, constantly telling Nicole how beautiful she was, how lucky he was to have found her. He loved showing her off at parties and events, introducing her as his girlfriend to other celebrities and athletes. Nicole, still young and impressionable, began to define herself through O.J.'s perception of her, gradually losing touch with her own interests and ambitions as she became more and more absorbed into his world. They lived together in O.J.'s mansion on Rockingham Drive in Brentwood, a sprawling estate that seemed like something out of a movie. The house was filled with trophies and memorabilia from O.J.'s football career, expensive artwork, and luxurious furnishings. Nicole learned to navigate this world of wealth and celebrity, becoming skilled at hosting dinner parties and charity events, always looking perfect and saying the right things. But even during these seemingly golden years, there were warning signs that those around them either missed or chose to ignore. O.J.'s possessiveness began to manifest early in their relationship, though it was initially disguised as protectiveness and devotion. He would question Nicole about where she went when they were apart, who she talked to, what she did with her time. He monitored her phone calls and became jealous of her friendships, particularly with other men. Nicole, young and inexperienced, initially interpreted this behavior as evidence of how much O.J. loved her, not recognizing it as the beginning of a pattern of control that would eventually consume their relationship. The possessiveness gradually escalated into more obvious controlling behavior. O.J. began dictating what Nicole could wear, where she could go, who she could spend time with. He isolated her from many of her old friends, convincing her that they were jealous of her new life or that they didn't understand their relationship. Nicole found herself becoming increasingly dependent on OJ not just financially, but emotionally and socially as well. Her world began to revolve entirely around his needs, his schedule, his moods. Simpson and Brown said their "I dose" on February 2, 1985, in an elaborate ceremony that was covered by the society pages and attended by celebrities from the worlds of sports and entertainment. Nicole looked like a fairy tale princess in her white gown, radiant with happiness and excitement about starting this new chapter of her life. The wedding seemed to represent the culmination of a perfect love story, the beautiful young woman and the famous athlete, united in what appeared to be a match made in heaven. For a time after their marriage, their life together seemed perfect from the outside. They lived in the magnificent Brentwood mansion, entertained celebrities and athletes regularly, and traveled extensively. Nicole embraced her role as the wife of a celebrity, attending charity events, supporting OJ's various business ventures, and creating a home that was frequently featured in lifestyle magazines. She was the picture of California glamour, with her sun-kissed skin, perfectly styled hair, and designer clothes. When she became pregnant with their first child, Sydney, born in 1985, and later with Justin, born in 1988, Nicole seemed to have achieved everything she had dreamed of as a young woman. But behind the closed doors of their Brentwood mansion, their marriage was deteriorating into something dark and frightening. The controlling behavior that had begun during their courtship intensified after marriage, with OJ treating Nicole more like a possession than a partner. Nicole Brown Simpson meticulously documented 62 instances of domestic abuse during their marriage, keeping a detailed record of OJ's violent outbursts and threats. These documents, which would later become crucial evidence, painted a picture of a woman living in constant fear, documenting each incident with dates, times, and descriptions of what had happened. The abuse wasn't just physical, it was psychological and emotional as well. OJ would rage at Nicole for hours, screaming at her about imagined slights or perceived disrespect. He criticized her appearance, her intelligence, her abilities as a mother. He made her feel worthless and dependent, constantly reminding her that without him, she would be nothing. The psychological abuse was perhaps even more damaging than the physical violence, eroding Nicole's self-esteem and confidence until she began to believe that she deserved the treatment she was receiving. Friends and family members later testified that they had witnessed OJ screaming at Nicole, grabbing her roughly, and making threats that left everyone in the room uncomfortable. At parties and social events, OJ would often humiliate Nicole in front of other people, making cutting remarks about her appearance or intelligence, then laughing as if he were just joking. Nicole learned to laugh along, to pretend that his cruel comments didn't hurt, but those close to her could see the pain in her eyes. The first documented incident of domestic violence that came to public attention occurred on New Year's Day 1989, though Nicole's records suggest there had been many previous incidents that never resulted in police involvement. Nicole had called 911 and then hid in the bushes outside the house after a particularly violent altercation that had taken place following a New Year's Eve party at their Rockingham home. The party had been a typical O.J. Simpson social event filled with celebrities, athletes, and other wealthy Los Angeles residents, all drinking expensive champagne and celebrating the new year in style. But as the evening progressed and O.J. drank more, his mood had turned dark and paranoid. He became convinced that Nicole was flirting with other men at the party, paying too much attention to the other guests and not enough to him. When the last guests finally left in the early hours of January 1st, O.J.'s simmering resentment exploded into violence. According to Nicole's later testimony, he grabbed her and began shaking her, screaming that she had embarrassed him in front of his friends. When she tried to defend herself, he struck her repeatedly, leaving her with a black eye, split lip, and bruises on her arms and neck. Terrified and in pain, Nicole managed to escape from the house and hide in the landscaping outside, wearing only a bra and sweatpants despite the cold January night. From her hiding place, she called 911 on a cordless phone, whispering her address and pleading for help. The 911 recording, which would later be played during the murder trial, captured Nicole's fear and desperation as she begged the operator to send police quickly, saying that her husband was going to kill her. When the police arrived at the Rockingham mansion, they found Nicole hiding in the bushes, shivering from cold and fear. Her face was swollen and bruised, her lip was bleeding, and she had finger marks on her throat. She was crying and shaking, telling the officers that OJ had beaten her and threatened to kill her. The responding officers took photographs of her injuries and filed a detailed report, but unfortunately, their handling of the incident reflected the attitudes toward domestic violence that were prevalent in law enforcement at the time. Rather than treating the incident as the serious felony assault it represented, the officers handled it as a routine domestic dispute. They didn't arrest OJ immediately, instead allowing him to remain in the house while they took Nicole's statement. They didn't properly secure the scene or collect all the physical evidence that might have supported more serious charges. Most damaging of all, they didn't take Nicole's fears seriously when she told them that she believed OJ was capable of killing her. OJ's reaction to the police investigation was telling. Rather than showing remorse or concern for Nicole's injuries, he seemed primarily worried about the potential impact on his public image and business interests. He immediately hired expensive lawyers who worked to minimize the incident and keep it out of the headlines. They argued that it was just a minor argument between husband and wife that had gotten slightly out of hand, nothing more than a misunderstanding fueled by too much alcohol and holiday stress. In 1989, Simpson pleaded no contest to spousal abuse and was sentenced to community service, probation, and required to undergo counseling. But he never seemed to take responsibility for his actions or acknowledge the severity of what he had done to Nicole. In interviews and public statements, he minimized the incident, claiming that the media and prosecutors were making a big deal out of nothing. He portrayed himself as the victim, complaining that his reputation was being unfairly damaged by people who didn't understand the complexities of his marriage. The plea agreement and light sentence sent a clear message to both OJ and Nicole about how seriously the justice system took domestic violence. For OJ, it confirmed his belief that his fame and wealth would protect him from serious consequences for his actions. For Nicole, it reinforced her growing conviction that no one would protect her from her husband's violence, that she was essentially on her own in dealing with his abuse. The pattern of abuse continued throughout their marriage, with friends and family members describing a cycle of violence followed by elaborate apologies and expensive gifts. After particularly bad incidents, OJ would shower Nicole with jewelry, flowers, and romantic gestures, begging her forgiveness and promising that it would never happen again. He would be charming and attentive for weeks or months, the perfect husband and father, making Nicole begin to believe that maybe he really had changed this time. But the violence always returned, often triggered by seemingly minor incidents. OJ would explode if dinner wasn't ready when he expected it, if Nicole seemed to be paying too much attention to someone else at a party, if she expressed opinions that differed from his own. The children, Sydney and Justin, began to witness these outbursts, seeing their father scream at their mother and sometimes physically assault her. Nicole tried to shield them from the worst of it, but in a house where domestic violence was a regular occurrence, it was impossible to completely protect them from the trauma. Nicole began confiding in close friends and family members about her fear of OJ, though she was careful about how much she revealed. She told her sister Denise that she believed OJ was capable of killing her if she ever left him permanently. She showed up to social events with unexplained bruises, her usual vivacious personality subdued and nervous. Friends noticed that she seemed to be walking on eggshells around OJ, carefully monitoring his moods and adjusting her behavior to avoid setting him off. The psychological impact of the abuse was devastating. Nicole, who had once been confident and outgoing, became increasingly withdrawn and anxious. She developed symptoms of what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, panic attacks, difficulty sleeping, and intrusive thoughts about violence. She began to lose weight, and friends noticed that her hands would shake when she talked about OJ or when he was around. Despite these fears, Nicole found the courage to file for divorce in February 1992, citing irreconcilable differences. The decision to leave OJ was one of the most difficult of her life, requiring her to overcome not just her fear of his reaction, but also her financial dependence on him and her concerns about the impact on their children. She had been with OJ for 15 years, since she was 18 years old, and had never really learned to be independent or self-sufficient. The divorce proceedings were acrimonious and bitter, with disputes over custody of the children and division of assets. OJ's lawyers fought aggressively to limit his financial obligations and to maintain his access to Sydney and Justin. They portrayed Nicole as an unfit mother who was trying to use the children to extract money from their client. Nicole, supported by her own legal team, fought back just as hard, determined to protect herself and her children from further abuse. The custody battle was particularly painful for Nicole. OJ used his wealth and connections to hire investigators who followed her and monitored her activities, looking for any evidence that could be used against her in court. He had private detectives take photographs of her when she went out with friends, trying to build a case that she was an irresponsible parent who cared more about her social life than her children's welfare. Despite OJ's efforts to complicate the proceedings, Nicole was ultimately granted custody of Sydney and Justin, along with a substantial financial settlement. The divorce was finalized in October 1992, but for Nicole, the end of her marriage was just the beginning of a new kind of nightmare. OJ's obsession with controlling her life didn't end with the divorce decree. If anything, it seemed to intensify. After the divorce, OJ continued to call Nicole constantly, sometimes dozens of times per day. He would show up at her home unannounced, claiming that he needed to see the children but really coming to check on what Nicole was doing and who she was spending time with. He followed her when she went out with friends, sometimes confronting the men she was seen with and warning them to stay away from his wife. Nicole confided to her sister Denise that she felt like she was being stalked by her own ex-husband. The harassment was relentless and sophisticated. OJ used his network of friends and business associates to keep tabs on Nicole's activities. He would call restaurants where she had dinner reservations to find out who she was dining with. He hired private investigators to follow her and take photographs. He even had friends call her pretending to be interested in dating her, then reporting back to him about her conversations and activities. Nicole tried various strategies to escape OJ's surveillance and harassment. She changed her phone number multiple times, but he always seemed to find out the new number within days. She considered moving away from Los Angeles but worried about taking the children away from their father and the life they knew. She installed security systems and changed the locks on her doors, but OJ always seemed to find ways to get around her precautions. The psychological impact of this post-divorce stalking was enormous. Nicole lived in constant fear, never knowing when OJ might appear or what he might do. She had trouble sleeping and developed severe anxiety about leaving her home or going out in public. She became hypervigilant, constantly checking over her shoulder and scrutinizing every phone call or visitor for signs that OJ was monitoring her. In the months leading up to June 1994, Nicole had begun trying to build a new life for herself despite OJ's continued harassment. She was dating occasionally, though she was careful to keep her relationships private to avoid triggering OJ's jealousy. She was spending more time with her family and working to rebuild friendships that had been damaged during her marriage. She had moved into a condominium on South Bundy Drive in Brentwood, a modest but comfortable home where she hoped to find some peace and independence. The Bundy Drive condo was a significant step toward independence for Nicole. Unlike the Rockingham mansion, which had always felt like OJ's domain, the condo was entirely hers. She decorated it according to her own taste, filled it with photographs of her children and mementos from her life before OJ. It was a sanctuary where she could be herself without constantly worrying about OJ's reactions or expectations. Nicole threw herself into creating a normal life for herself and her children. She attended Sydney's school events and soccer games, helped with homework, and tried to provide stability and security despite the ongoing stress of OJ's harassment. She took aerobics classes, went shopping with friends, and slowly began to rediscover interests and activities that she had abandoned during her marriage. It was in this context that Nicole developed a friendship with Ron Goldman, a 25-year-old aspiring actor and model who worked as a waiter at Mezzaluna restaurant. Ron was everything that OJ was not: gentle, respectful, and genuinely interested in Nicole as a person rather than as a trophy or possession. He was working his way through college, taking acting classes during the day and waiting tables at night, dreaming of making it in Hollywood like so many other young people who came to Los Angeles with big dreams and limited resources. Ron had grown up in the Chicago area and moved to California with his family when he was in high school. He was close to his father, Fred Goldman, and his sister, Kim, and maintained strong family relationships despite the distance from his childhood home. Friends described him as kind-hearted and ambitious, someone who treated everyone with equal respect regardless of their social status or wealth. He was known for his infectious smile, his enthusiasm for life, and his genuine interest in other people's stories and experiences. At Mezzaluna, Ron was popular with both customers and coworkers. He was professional and attentive, but also warm and friendly, the kind of server who could make regular customers feel like family. He took pride in his work and was saving money for acting classes and headshots, determined to make it in the entertainment industry through hard work and persistence rather than connections or shortcuts. Ron and Nicole's friendship was innocent and casual, based on mutual respect and shared interests in fitness and healthy living. They would sometimes meet for coffee after Nicole's aerobics classes or work out together at the gym, but there was no romantic relationship between them despite later speculation and innuendo from media coverage and OJ's defense team. For Nicole, Ron represented the possibility of having normal, healthy relationships with men, something she had almost forgotten during her years with OJ. Nicole appreciated Ron's genuine friendship and the fact that he seemed to like her for who she really was, not because of her connection to a famous ex-husband or her appearance. Ron never tried to impress her with expensive gifts or grand gestures. Instead, he listened when she talked, made her laugh, and treated her with the kind of basic respect and kindness that had been missing from her life for so long. On the evening of June 12th, after the dance recital and dinner at Mezzaluna, Nicole returned home to her Bundy Drive condominium with her children around 8:30 p.m. She put Sydney and Justin to bed, reading them bedtime stories and tucking them in as she did every night. The bedtime routine was one of Nicole's favorite parts of the day, a peaceful time when she could focus entirely on her children and forget about the stresses and complications of her adult life. After the children were asleep, Nicole settled in for what she expected to be a quiet evening at home. She had no plans to go out, no visitors expected. She changed into comfortable clothes, a black halter dress that she often wore for relaxing at home, and was probably planning to read or watch television. It was exactly the kind of ordinary Sunday evening that represented the peaceful life she had been trying to build for herself and her children. At some point during the evening, Nicole's mother, Judy the Brown, realized that she had left her prescription sunglasses at Mezzaluna during dinner. The glasses were expensive and prescription, not something that could be easily replaced, so Judy called the restaurant to see if they had been found. The staff at Mezzaluna confirmed that they had the glasses and said that someone could drop them off. Ron Goldman, who was finishing his shift at the restaurant, volunteered to deliver the glasses to Nicole's home on his way back to his apartment. It was a simple act of customer service, the kind of extra effort that made Ron popular with Mezzaluna's clientele. He had no way of knowing that this small favor would cost him his life and forever link his name to one of the most notorious crimes in American history. What happened next would become the subject of endless speculation, investigation, and debate. According to the timeline established by investigators, Ron arrived at Nicole's condo sometime around 10:15 p.m. on June 12, 1994. The front gate to the condominium complex was secured, so he would have had to ring the buzzer or call out to Nicole to let her know he was there with her mother's glasses. The attack that followed was swift and brutal, suggesting that the killer had been lying in wait or had arrived at the scene shortly before or after Ron. Forensic evidence would later indicate that blood drops found alongside a trail of bloody shoe prints leading from the victims matched Simpson's blood, with the error rate being 1 in 200. The killer wore expensive Bruno Magli shoes, size 12, leaving distinctive bloody footprints throughout the crime scene. The shoes were a key piece of evidence in the murder case, as the killer left a bloody size 12 shoe print at the scene of the crime. These Italian-made shoes were rare and expensive, sold in only a few stores in the United States. The Lorenzo-style Bruno Magli shoes in size 12 were sold in only 40 stores nationwide, and investigators estimated that only about 300 pairs had been sold in O.J.'s size. During the criminal trial, O.J. denied ever owning Bruno Magli shoes, but additional evidence of domestic violence was presented, as well as 31 pre-1994 photos of Simpson wearing Bruno Magli shoes, including one that was published 6 months before the murders, proving it could not be a forgery. The forensic evidence suggested that Ron fought desperately for his life. His hands showed defensive wounds where he had tried to ward off the knife, and his clothing was torn from the struggle. The blood spatter patterns indicated that he had been moved or dragged during the attack, suggesting a prolonged and violent confrontation. Ron's knuckles were scraped, and there were signs that he had fought with everything he had to survive, but he was ultimately overwhelmed by his attacker. Nicole's attack was even more savage and personal. The coroner would later determine that her throat had been slashed so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. The wound was so severe that it severed her larynx and came within millimeters of completely severing her head from her body. The killer had stood over her as she lay dying, continuing to inflict wounds even after she was clearly beyond help. It was a crime of rage and hatred, the kind of overkill that forensic experts typically associate with deeply personal motives, often involving intimate relationships. The scene that greeted the first responders the next morning was something that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Nicole's body was found crumpled at the bottom of the steps leading to her front door, lying in a pool of blood that had spread across the concrete walkway. She was wearing the black halter dress she had put on for a quiet evening at home, now torn and stained with blood. Her long blonde hair was matted with blood, and her eyes stared sightlessly at the California sky she had loved so much. Ron's body was found nearby, slumped against a tree in the small garden area beside the walkway. His white shirt was torn and bloody, and his hands were covered with defensive wounds. Near Goldman's body, investigators found a blue knit cap, a left-hand extra-large Eris isotoner light leather glove, and the envelope containing Judy the Brown's prescription glasses. The envelope was still clutched in Ron's hand, a tragic reminder of the simple errand that had cost him his life. The first person to discover the bodies was Nicole's neighbor, Sukrabastip, who was walking his dog early Monday morning around 12:10 a.m. The dog, a white Akita named Kato that belonged to Nicole, was found wandering the neighborhood with blood on its paws and fur, barking frantically and acting extremely agitated. When Bozteep followed the dog back toward Nicole's condo, he saw what appeared to be a woman's body lying in a pool of blood and immediately called 911. The Los Angeles Police Department's response to the crime scene would later become a major source of controversy and criticism. The first officers to arrive failed to properly secure the area, allowing evidence to be contaminated and the crime scene to be compromised. Neighbors and curious onlookers were allowed to get too close to the bodies and the physical evidence, potentially contaminating crucial forensic materials. Detective Mark Furman was one of the first investigators on the scene, and his handling of the case would later become central to the defense's strategy. Furman was called to testify regarding his discovery of evidence in the Simpson case, including a bloody glove recovered at Simpson's estate. However, his credibility would be severely damaged when the defense uncovered recordings of him using racial slurs and making racist statements during interviews for a screenplay about police work. As news of the murders spread throughout Los Angeles and then across the nation, attention quickly focused on O.J. Simpson. The police were well aware of the history of domestic violence between O.J. and Nicole, and statistical analysis of homicide cases shows that in instances of domestic murder, the current or former intimate partner is the most likely perpetrator. When detectives went to notify O.J. of his ex-wife's death, they found suspicious evidence that would form the foundation of their case against him. At O.J.'s mansion on Rockingham Drive, just a few miles from Nicole's condo, police discovered what appeared to be a trail of blood leading from his white Ford Bronco to his front door. The blood drops were consistent with someone who was bleeding from the left hand, and investigators noted that O.J. had a fresh cut on his left middle finger when they interviewed him. Inside the house, they found a bloody glove that appeared to match the one found at the crime scene, as well as dark socks at the foot of O.J.'s bed that would later test positive for Nicole's blood. O.J.'s reaction to the news of Nicole's death struck many observers as strange and inappropriate. Rather than showing the kind of grief or shock that would be expected from someone whose ex-wife had been brutally murdered, he seemed primarily concerned with his own schedule and commitments. He was in Chicago on business when the murders occurred, having taken a late-night flight on American Airlines Flight 668 immediately after the killings. When Detective Ron Phillips called him at his Chicago hotel to inform him of Nicole's death, O.J.'s first questions weren't about how she had died or whether the children were safe, but about when he would be able to return to Los Angeles and whether this would interfere with his golf game scheduled for later that week. The timeline of O.J.'s activities on the evening of June 12 became crucial to the prosecution's case. According to witness testimony and airline records, O.J. had been at home during the crucial time period when the murders occurred. His house guest, Brian Cato Kalin, testified that he had heard loud thumping sounds outside his room around 10:45 p.m., shortly after the estimated time of the murders. The limousine driver who was scheduled to take O.J. to the airport arrived at 10:25 p.m. but couldn't locate him initially, not seeing him until around 11 p.m. when O.J. appeared from the direction of his house. The evidence against O.J. began mounting quickly as the investigation progressed. His blood was found at the murder scene, mixed with the victim's blood in several locations. Blood, hair, and fibers from both Nicole and Ron were found in Simpson's white Ford Bronco and at his Rockingham home. The blood evidence was particularly damning. Drops of O.J.'s blood were found on the back gate at Nicole's condo, in his Bronco, in his home, and on the glove found at his residence. Over the course of the investigation and subsequent trial, prosecutors would present what they considered overwhelming physical evidence. DNA evidence included blood drops found alongside a trail of bloody shoe prints leading from the victims that matched Simpson's blood. Fibers found on Goldman's shirt matched fibers found on socks in Simpson's bedroom. Hair evidence consistent with O.J.'s was found on the knit cap at the crime scene. The prosecution argued that this combination of evidence created an unbreakable chain linking O.J. to the murders. When O.J. returned from Chicago on June 13th, he He was questioned by police at Parker Center, but the interview was relatively brief and non-confrontational. Detectives Tom Lang and Philip Van Adder conducted the questioning, but they failed to press O.J. on the inconsistencies in his story or the physical evidence that was already pointing in his direction. Critics would later argue that this was another example of preferential treatment for a celebrity, that any ordinary suspect with similar evidence against them would have been arrested immediately and subjected to much more aggressive questioning. During the interview, O.J. claimed that he had cut his hand on a glass in his Chicago hotel room when he learned of Nicole's death, but this explanation was contradicted by other evidence. The limousine driver who had taken him to the airport testified that he had noticed a cut on O.J.'s hand before the trip to Chicago, and investigators found blood drops at O.J.'s home that had clearly been deposited before his departure for Chicago. As the investigation continued, more disturbing evidence emerged about O.J.'s state of mind in the weeks leading up to the murders. Friends and acquaintances reported that he had been increasingly agitated about Nicole's social life and her apparent efforts to move on from their relationship. He had been seen following her to restaurants and social events, sometimes confronting men who showed interest in her. His behavior had become so erratic that some of Nicole's friends had begun to worry about her safety. The investigation also revealed that O.J. had been making threats about Nicole to various people in the months before her death. He told a friend that he would kill Nicole if he ever caught her with another man, and he made similar threatening statements to other acquaintances. These threats were particularly significant because they established a pattern of escalating violence and demonstrated O.J.'s intent to harm Nicole if she continued to defy his attempts to control her life. On June 17, 1994, after a week of mounting evidence and intense media scrutiny, Los Angeles District Attorney Gil Garcetti announced that O.J. Simpson would be charged with the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. The charges were first-degree murder with special circumstances, making O.J. eligible for the death penalty if convicted. The announcement sent shockwaves through the sports and entertainment communities, where O.J. had been a beloved figure for decades. O.J. was scheduled to turn himself into police at 11 a.m. on June 17th, but he failed to appear at the arranged time and location. Instead, he became a fugitive, leading to one of the most surreal and memorable episodes in American television history. The drama began when O.J.'s friend Al Cowlings called police to report that O.J. was in his white Ford Bronco, armed with a gun, and threatening to kill himself. What followed was a low-speed chase that captivated the nation and became one of the most watched events in television history. An estimated 95 million viewers tuned in to watch the bizarre spectacle of O.J. Simpson, once America's most beloved athlete, fleeing from police in a white Bronco driven by his friend. The chase played out in real time on television, with news helicopters providing aerial coverage and ground units following at a respectful distance. The chase itself was unlike anything that had ever been seen on television. O.J. sat in the back seat of the Bronco, reportedly holding a gun to his head and threatening suicide while Cowlings drove slowly along the freeways of Los Angeles. Police cars followed at a safe distance, unwilling to risk a confrontation that might result in O.J.'s death and the loss of their prime suspect. The procession moved at speeds of only 35 miles per hour, creating a bizarre parade that wound through the streets and highways of Southern California. The public's reaction to the chase was extraordinary and revealing. People lined the freeway overpasses, some cheering for O.J. and holding signs of support, others calling for his arrest. The reaction was starkly divided along racial lines, with many African Americans viewing O.J. as a victim of police racism and systemic injustice, while many white Americans were convinced of his guilt and frustrated by what they saw as preferential treatment. The chase ended at O.J.'s Brentwood mansion, where he had lived with Nicole during their marriage. The white Bronco pulled into the driveway, and O.J. remained inside for nearly an hour while police negotiators tried to convince him to surrender peacefully. The scene was surreal, hundreds of police officers, SWAT team members, and media personnel surrounding the home of a man who had once been celebrated as a hero, now wanted for double murder. Eventually, O.J. was convinced by his lawyer, Robert Shapiro, to give up his weapon and surrender to police. He was arrested without incident and taken to the Los Angeles County Jail, where he was held without bail pending trial. The chase had lasted nearly 2 hours and had been watched by more people than had viewed the Super Bowl that year, making it one of the most watched events in television history. The arrest marked the beginning of what would become known as the Trial of the Century, a legal proceeding that would dominate American culture for nearly a year and expose deep divisions in American society about race, class, celebrity, and justice. The case would be tried in the Los Angeles County Superior Court, with Judge Lance Ito presiding over proceedings that would be broadcast live on television, turning the courtroom into a stage for legal theater unlike anything that had been seen before. The prosecution team was led by Marcia Clark, an experienced prosecutor who had handled numerous high-profile cases, and Christopher Darden, an African-American prosecutor who was brought onto the team partly to counter potential claims of racial bias. Clark was known for her aggressive courtroom style and her ability to connect with juries, while Darden brought expertise in domestic violence cases and a personal understanding of the racial dynamics that would inevitably play a role in the trial. The prosecution's strategy was straightforward. They would present the overwhelming physical evidence linking O.J. to the murders, establish his motive through the history of domestic violence, and demonstrate that he had the opportunity to commit the crimes. They believed that the evidence was so compelling that no reasonable jury could find O.J. innocent, regardless of his celebrity status or the racial dynamics of the case. O.J., meanwhile, assembled what the media quickly dubbed the Dream Team of defense attorneys, a group of some of the most skilled and expensive lawyers in the country. The team was led by Johnny Cochran, a charismatic African-American attorney who was known for his ability to connect with juries and his expertise in cases involving racial issues. The team also included Alan Dershowitz, a Harvard Law School professor and appellate expert, Lee Bailey, a legendary criminal defense attorney, Robert Shapiro, who had initially been O.J.'s lead counsel, and Robert Kardashian, a close friend of O.J.'s who had recently reactivated his law license to join the defense team. The defense strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and effectiveness. Rather than trying to prove O.J.'s innocence, they focused on creating reasonable doubt about his guilt. They argued that O.J. was being framed by racist police officers who were determined to convict a successful black man, and they systematically attacked every piece of evidence presented by the prosecution, suggesting that it had been contaminated, mishandled, or planted. The trial began on January 24, 1995, with jury selection, a process that took nearly 2 months and revealed the deep racial divisions in Los Angeles. The final jury consisted of 8 African Americans, 2 whites, 1 Hispanic, and 1 person of mixed race. The racial composition of the jury was significant, as polls consistently showed that African Americans were much more likely than whites to believe in O.J.'s innocence or at least to have reasonable doubt about his guilt. The prosecution's case began with a presentation of the physical evidence, which they argued created an unbreakable chain linking O.J. to the murders. They presented DNA evidence showing that O.J.'s blood was found at the crime scene, that the victim's blood was found in his car and home, and that hair and fiber evidence connected him to the murders. They argued that the probability of this evidence being coincidental was so small as to be virtually impossible. The DNA evidence was particularly compelling. Blood found at the crime scene matched O.J.'s DNA profile, with the probability of a random match being approximately 1 in 170 million. Blood found in O.J.'s Bronco contained DNA from both victims, while blood found on the socks in his bedroom matched Nicole's DNA profile. The prosecution argued that this evidence alone was sufficient to convict O.J. of the murders. The prosecution also presented evidence of O.J.'s history of domestic violence against Nicole, including photographs of her bruised face from the 1989 incident and testimony from friends and family members about his controlling and threatening behavior. They played the 911 recording from New Year's Day 1989, allowing the jury to hear Nicole's frightened voice as she begged for help. They argued that this evidence established O.J.'s motive for the murders and showed that he was capable of violence against Nicole. The timeline evidence was another crucial component of the prosecution's case. They argued that O.J. had a window of opportunity to commit the murders between approximately 9:35 p.m., when he was last seen at his home, and 10:55 p.m., when he was observed by the limousine driver. They contended that this time frame was sufficient for O.J. to drive to Nicole's condo, commit the murders, and return home to prepare for his trip to Chicago. However, the defense mounted a brilliant and aggressive counterattack that systematically undermined every aspect of the prosecution's case. They began by attacking the LAPD's handling of the crime scene and the collection of evidence, arguing that the investigation had been so contaminated and mishandled that none of the physical evidence could be trusted. The defense argued that the crime scene had not been properly secured, that evidence had been contaminated by the large number of people who had access to it, and that the chain of custody had been broken in numerous instances. They presented expert testimony suggesting that the blood evidence could have been planted or contaminated, and they argued that the DNA results were unreliable because of the poor handling of the samples. The defense's most effective strategy was their focus on the racial aspects of the case, particularly their attack on Detective Mark Furman, who had found crucial evidence including the bloody glove at O.J.'s home. The defense uncovered recordings of Furman using racial slurs and making racist statements during interviews for a screenplay about police work. In the recordings, Furman used the word "nigger" repeatedly and described incidents of police brutality and evidence planting. The Furman tapes were devastating to the prosecution's case. When Furman was recalled to testify about the recordings, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination when asked whether he had planted evidence in the Simpson case. This created the strong impression that Furman had something to hide and that the evidence he had found might have been planted to frame O.J. The defense argued that Furman's racism provided a motive for framing O.J., suggesting that he and other officers had conspired to plant evidence because they were determined to convict a successful black man. They contended that Furman had planted the bloody glove at O.J.'s home and had tampered with other evidence to strengthen the case against him. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution asked O.J. to try on the bloody gloves in front of the jury. The demonstration backfired spectacularly when the gloves appeared to be too small for O.J.'s hands, leading to defense attorney Johnny Cochran's famous phrase, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." The moment became an iconic image of the trial, with O.J. struggling to put on the gloves while the jury watched. Later analysis would suggest that the gloves appeared too small for several reasons. They had shrunk from being soaked in blood, O.J. was wearing latex gloves underneath, and he may have been deliberately making his hands larger by spreading his fingers. But the damage to the prosecution's case was done. The jury had seen O.J. apparently unable to put on the gloves, creating a powerful visual argument for his innocence. The defense also presented an alternative timeline that suggested O.J. could not have committed the murders and still made his flight to Chicago. They argued that the prosecution's timeline was too tight, that there wasn't enough time for O.J. to drive to Nicole's condo, commit 2 murders, dispose of evidence, clean himself up, and get to the airport. They presented evidence of O.J.'s activities that evening, including his presence at his daughter's recital and his interactions with various people, to suggest that he didn't have the opportunity to commit the crimes. The racial dynamics of the case became increasingly apparent as the trial progressed. The defense skillfully played on the African American community's historical mistrust of the police and the justice system, arguing that O.J. was being persecuted because of his race and success. They reminded the jury of the recent Rodney King beating and the riots that had followed the acquittal of the officers involved, suggesting that the LAPD had a pattern of racist behavior. Johnny Cochran's summation was a masterpiece of courtroom oratory that explicitly connected O.J.'s case to the broader struggle for civil rights and racial justice. He argued that the jury had the power to send a message about police misconduct and racial bias, suggesting that acquitting O.J. would strike a blow against systemic racism. His closing argument was emotional and powerful, combining legal arguments with appeals to racial solidarity and historical grievances. The prosecution's closing argument, delivered by Marcia Clark, focused on the evidence and the victims, arguing that Nicole and Ron deserved justice regardless of O.J.'s celebrity status or the racial dynamics of the case. Clark presented a passionate plea for the jury to focus on the facts rather than being swayed by emotional appeals about racism and police misconduct. After months of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict in less than 4 hours, an unusually short time for such a complex case. The speed of the deliberation suggested that the jurors had made up their minds before retiring to the jury room, possibly indicating that they had been convinced by the defense's arguments about reasonable doubt and police misconduct. On October 3, 1995, in a moment that was watched by an estimated 150 million people worldwide, O.J. Simpson was found not guilty of the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. The reading of the verdict was one of the most dramatic moments in television history, with O.J. breaking into a broad smile as the words, "Not guilty," were read, while the victims' families sat in stunned silence. The reaction to the verdict was immediate and starkly divided along racial lines. Many African Americans celebrated the acquittal, viewing it as a rare instance of a black man receiving the benefit of the doubt from the justice system and a vindication after decades of unequal treatment. In barbershops, churches, and community centers across the country, African Americans cheered and embraced, seeing O.J.'s acquittal as a victory against a system that had historically been biased against them. Many white Americans, meanwhile, watched the verdict in shock and disbelief, convinced that O.J. had literally gotten away with murder. They saw the acquittal as evidence that celebrity and expensive lawyers could overcome even the most compelling evidence, and they were disturbed by what they perceived as the jury's willingness to ignore facts in favor of racial solidarity. The acquittal was a complex moment in American history, representing different things to different people depending on their race, class, and personal experiences with the justice system. For many African Americans, it was a rare instance of the system working in favor of a black defendant, a moment when reasonable doubt was actually given the benefit of the doubt. For many white Americans, it was a miscarriage of justice that highlighted the dangers of racial bias in jury selection and deliberation. The aftermath of the criminal trial was marked by continued controversy and legal proceedings. While O.J. had been acquitted of criminal charges, he still faced a civil trial brought by the families of both victims. The civil trial, which began in 1996, operated under different rules and standards than the criminal proceeding, requiring only a preponderance of evidence rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The civil trial was a very different affair from the criminal proceeding. The judge, Hiroshi Fujisaki, banned cameras from the courtroom and imposed strict rules on the proceedings, preventing the kind of theatrical atmosphere that had characterized the criminal trial. The jury was also different, with only 2 African Americans among the 12 jurors, reflecting the different venue and jury selection process. The evidence presented in the civil trial was largely the same as in the criminal case, but the context and presentation were significantly different. Without the distractions of cameras and media coverage, the focus was more clearly on the evidence and less on the personalities and racial dynamics that had dominated the criminal trial. The plaintiff's attorneys were able to present their case more methodically and effectively, without the constant interruptions and objections that had characterized the criminal proceedings. In February 1997, the civil jury found O.J. Simpson liable for the wrongful deaths of both Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, ordering him to pay $33.5 million in compensatory and punitive damages to the victims' families. The verdict was a vindication for those who believed that O.J. was guilty of the murders, providing a measure of justice even if it couldn't bring back the victims or result in criminal punishment. The civil trial verdict highlighted the different standards of proof required in criminal and civil cases, demonstrating how the same evidence could lead to different outcomes depending on the legal context. While the criminal jury had found reasonable doubt about O.J.'s guilt, the civil jury concluded that the evidence was sufficient to establish his liability by a preponderance of the evidence. The years following the trials were not kind to O.J. Simpson. His reputation was permanently damaged, his acting and broadcasting career effectively ended, and he struggled with financial problems related to the civil judgment and his mounting legal bills. He was forced to sell many of his possessions, including his Heisman Trophy, to pay debts and legal fees. The man who had once been one of America's most beloved athletes became a pariah, shunned by former friends and unable to rebuild his public image. O.J.'s personal life also continued to be marked by controversy and legal troubles. He was involved in several incidents that suggested he had not learned from his experiences, including allegations of road rage and domestic violence involving subsequent relationships. His behavior patterns seemed to confirm what many observers had suspected, that the murders were not an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of violence and controlling behavior. In 2008, O.J. Simpson was found guilty of armed robbery, kidnapping, and other charges related to an incident at a Las Vegas hotel. He was sentenced to 33 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 9 years. The conviction was seen by many as a form of delayed justice, a chance for the legal system to finally hold O.J. accountable for criminal behavior even if it wasn't for the murders that had made him infamous. Simpson was granted parole in July 2017 after serving 9 years in prison. His release was covered extensively by the media, though the reception was much more subdued than the celebration that had greeted his 1995 acquittal. By 2017, public opinion had shifted significantly, with many people who had once supported him now viewing him with suspicion and skepticism. The O.J. Simpson case continued to fascinate the public and influence popular culture for decades after the trial ended. Countless books, documentaries, and television series have examined every aspect of the case, from the investigation to the trial to the broader social implications. The case has been analyzed by legal scholars, criminologists, sociologists, and cultural critics, all trying to understand its significance and lasting impact. The FX series, The People v. O.J. Simpson: American Crime Story, which premiered in 2016, brought the case to a new generation of viewers and won critical acclaim for its nuanced portrayal of the racial and social dynamics that shaped the trial. The ESPN documentary O.J. Made in America, which won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, provided a comprehensive examination of O.J.'s life and the broader context of race relations in America. These modern re-examinations of the case have generally been more critical of O.J. and more sympathetic to the victims and their families. They have also provided deeper analysis of the racial and social issues that made the case such a cultural phenomenon, helping viewers understand why the trial divided America so dramatically and why it continues to resonate today. For the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, the case represented a tragedy that went far beyond legal proceedings and media coverage. They lost beloved family members in a horrific act of violence, and then had to endure years of public scrutiny, legal battles, and painful reminders of their loss. The media circus that surrounded the case often seemed to lose sight of the fact that real people had died, that real families were grieving, and that the spectacle of the trial was built on a foundation of genuine human suffering. Nicole's children, Sydney and Justin, were particularly affected by the case and its aftermath. They grew up in the shadow of their mother's murder and their father's notoriety, forced to navigate a complex legacy of fame, tragedy, and unanswered questions. Both children have largely stayed out of the public eye, understandably seeking privacy and normalcy in the wake of such public trauma. The Goldman family, led by Ron's father Fred, became passionate advocates for victims' rights and continued to pursue justice for their son long after the criminal trial ended. Fred Goldman wrote books about the case, appeared on television programs, and spoke publicly about his belief that O.J. Simpson was responsible for his son's death. The family's dignity and persistence in the face of unimaginable loss was a testament to their love for Ron and their commitment to his memory. Fred Goldman's book, His Name is Ron, published in 2014, provided a deeply personal account of the family's experience and their ongoing efforts to seek justice. The book revealed the devastating impact of Ron's death on his family and their frustration with a legal system that seemed more interested in celebrity and spectacle than in providing justice for victims. Nicole's family also struggled with the aftermath of the case and the constant media attention. Her sister Denise Brown became an advocate for domestic violence awareness, using Nicole's story to educate others about the warning signs of abusive relationships and the importance of taking domestic violence seriously. The family established the Nicole Brown Simpson Foundation to help other victims of domestic violence, trying to create something positive from their devastating loss. The foundation's work highlighted one of the most important but often overlooked aspects of the case: its role in raising awareness about domestic violence. Nicole's story brought national attention to the issue of intimate partner violence and helped people understand that domestic abuse affects women from all backgrounds, including those who appear to have wealth, status, and resources. The case also demonstrated the ways in which domestic violence can escalate to homicide, particularly when victims try to leave abusive relationships. Statistics show that the period immediately after separation is the most dangerous time for domestic violence victims, as abusers often become more violent when they lose control over their partners. Nicole's death fit this pattern perfectly, occurring at a time when she was building an independent life and moving beyond O.J.'s control. The O.J. Simpson case remains one of the most significant criminal trials in American history, not just because of the celebrity of the defendant or the dramatic nature of the proceedings, but because of what it revealed about American society. The case exposed deep racial divisions that continue to influence American politics and culture today, highlighted the problem of domestic violence in ways that led to important legal and social changes, and raised questions about celebrity justice that remain relevant in an era of social media and reality television. The trial also marked a turning point in media coverage of criminal proceedings. The wall-to-wall television coverage, the analysis by legal experts, and the public's voracious appetite for details about the case established a template for subsequent high-profile trials. The O.J. trial was arguably the first truly modern media spectacle, paving the way for the reality TV culture that would dominate American entertainment in the decades that followed. The case showed how the same set of facts could be interpreted completely differently depending on one's perspective, life experiences, and cultural background. The evidence that seemed overwhelming to many white Americans was viewed with suspicion by many African Americans who had learned to distrust police and prosecutors. The racial divide in reactions to the case reflected deeper issues about justice, equality, and the American dream that continue to challenge the nation today. Looking back more than 30 years later, the O.J. Simpson case serves as a reminder of the complexity of the American justice system and the ways in which race, class, and celebrity can influence legal outcomes. It demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the adversarial system, showing how skilled lawyers can create reasonable doubt even in the face of compelling evidence. while also revealing how public opinion and media coverage can influence legal proceedings in ways that may not serve the interests of justice. The case also highlighted the importance of domestic violence as a serious crime that requires aggressive prosecution and comprehensive prevention efforts. Nicole's death helped change the way police and prosecutors handle domestic violence cases, leading to mandatory arrest policies, specialized domestic violence courts, and improved training for law enforcement officers. These changes have undoubtedly saved lives, making Nicole's tragedy meaningful in ways that extend beyond the legal proceedings that followed her death. Most importantly, the O.J. Simpson case serves as a reminder that behind every high-profile trial are real people with real lives, hopes, and dreams. Nicole Brown Simpson was not just a victim in a famous murder case. She was a devoted mother trying to build a better life for herself and her children. Ron Goldman was not just a murder victim. He was a young man with aspirations and dreams, someone who died simply because he tried to do a favor for a friend. Their stories deserve to be remembered not just as evidence in a famous trial, but as examples of lives cut tragically short by senseless violence. They remind us that domestic violence is not just a private matter between couples, but a serious crime that can escalate to homicide if not addressed. They show us the importance of taking threats seriously, of supporting victims who are trying to leave abusive relationships, and of holding perpetrators accountable for their actions. The O.J. Simpson case will continue to be studied and debated for generations to come, serving as a lens through which to examine American society and the ongoing challenges of achieving justice and equality. Whatever one believes about O.J. Simpson's guilt or innocence, there is no dispute about the tragedy at the center of the case. 2 young people died violently on a warm June night in Brentwood, and their families and friends have spent the decades since trying to make sense of their loss and find some measure of peace in the face of unanswered questions. The case represents a crossroads in American culture, a moment when issues of race, celebrity, domestic violence, and justice collided in the most public way possible. It showed us both the best and worst of the American legal system, the power of skilled advocacy, and the dangers of prejudice and bias. It reminded us that justice is not always synonymous with truth, and that the search for both requires constant vigilance and commitment from all members of society. In the end, the O.J. Simpson case is a story about America itself, its dreams and disappointments, its progress and setbacks, its ongoing struggle to live up to its highest ideals while confronting its deepest divisions. It is a story that continues to resonate today because the issues it raised about race, justice, celebrity, and violence remain as relevant and challenging as ever. The case serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to action, reminding us that the work of building a more just and equitable society is never finished, and that the price of failure is measured not just in legal outcomes, but in human lives.